In a world where silence is mistaken for weakness and uniforms define status, one sentence can flip everything. Witness what happens when power meets its match. For more stories like this, subscribe to Simply Stories. The day began like every other in the glass fortress that pierced the clouds. Morning light shimmered through the panoramic windows of the penthouse, draping the marble floors in gold. The scent of imported coffee drifted through the air as expensive shoes clicked across polished tiles. Everything was designed to impress, every surface gleaming, every detail curated for power and perfection. And amid it all, she entered silently. No grand entrance, no one to greet her. She carried no designer bag, no click of heels, just quiet purpose. Dressed in her modest uniform, she moved like a shadow, wiping surfaces already spotless, straightening what was already straight. She had done this 100 times before. She was the first to arrive, always. Like clockwork, she was the last to be seen. The CEO, towering in reputation and wealth, appeared with his usual entourage. His voice boomed as he issued rapid-fire demands. "Where's my schedule? Has the driver arrived? Where the hell is my cufflink?" His anger was sharp and shallow, a blade searching for anything to cut. His staff scrambled. They knew better than to answer too slowly or worse offer excuses. And then his eyes landed on her, quiet, composed. Folding a napkin, he stormed toward her. His voice rose louder, echoing through the high-ceilinged hall. You were in my room yesterday morning, weren't you?" She didn't answer immediately. She never rushed to speak. That alone seemed to enrage him. "Did you take it? Do you even know what it's worth? You think it's just a little piece of metal? The cufflink is worth more than your entire year's salary." She gently set down the cloth she had been folding, standing still, not shrinking back. His tone grew nastier. "People like you don't understand value. You don't belong in places like this. You think we owe you something just because you scrub our floors?" Guests nearby exchanged uneasy glances. The chef froze mid-motion. A server lowered his gaze. No one stepped in. No one spoke. The power dynamic was clear. He was the king of this castle, and she, to them, was just another uniformed nobody. But something in her eyes began to change. The way she stood, the stillness of her posture. He didn't notice it, he was too busy unloading. "Maybe if you focused more on your work and less on daydreaming, you wouldn't keep messing up," he shouted. Then came the insult that cracked the air like a whip, vicious and racial, laced with centuries of ignorance. Laughter bubbled from a few guests, the kind meant to blend in, to ease the discomfort. But the silence that followed was thunderous. She didn't flinch, not once. Instead, she calmly reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small cloth, began wiping her hands. Slowly, precisely. The CEO glared at her, expecting an apology, a flurry of stammered denials, or even tears. But she gave him none of that. She folded the cloth, placed it on the counter beside her, and finally lifted her gaze. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't tremble. With measured calm, she said one sentence. The sentence was not loud, but it hit like a brick through a stained glass window. Every person in the room turned. The laughter died. The chef froze again, this time with wide eyes. Server dropped a tray, and the CEO, his face drained of color. The air changed, thickened with confusion, disbelief, and something else, respect. It's not for him, for her. But that sentence, what she said, is not revealed. Not yet. She turned and walked away, returning to her duties with the same quiet grace. But nothing felt the same. The atmosphere had shifted. Something about her presence now carried weight, authority. Her silence had been mistaken for subservience, her quietness for weakness. And now, every eye that once looked through her couldn't stop watching. The CEO barked a command, trying to regain control. "Get her out of here, I want her fired now." But no one moved. His assistant stared down at the floor. Security looked at each other, unsure. Even his guests were whispering, asking, "Who is she?" The CEO walked off, mumbling under his breath, shaken but unwilling to show it. Behind him, the staff slowly returned to motion, but everything was off balance. Questions hung in the air. Who was she really? Why did that one sentence shake the foundation of a man who thought he owned the room? And most of all, what did she mean by it? She continued her work with the same quiet purpose. But from that moment on, people watched her differently, not as a maid, not as background, but as someone who knew something they didn't, someone who held power not in shouting, but in knowing, and deep down they all understood something had just begun. The slap of her words still echoed in the minds of those who had witnessed the scene. Though the exact sentence remained unspoken to the outside world, its effect was undeniable. Something had shifted, not just in the room that morning, but in the very structure of the household. The woman in the maid's uniform continued her duties as if nothing had happened. She polished mirrors, arranged flowers, and reset dining tables with the same precision as before. But the way people looked at her was different now. The staff whispered more than usual. Some avoided her gaze. Others watched her with newfound curiosity. It wasn't fear, it was confusion wrapped in awe. There was something about her. The way she carried herself, now silent but deliberate. Like she had nothing to prove but everything under control, was hard to ignore. Later that evening, long after the shouting CEO had vanished to his usual wine-soaked dinners and elite distractions, a few of the younger staff gathered in the kitchen. "Did you see how she stood there? Like she wasn't scared of him at all?" one murmured. Another, older, leaned in closer. "I know that voice. I swear I've heard her speak before, not here. Somewhere else, somewhere important." They exchanged looks, not quite sure if they were imagining things or if something much bigger was going on. One of them, a former temp from a corporate building downtown, began to piece it together, but kept their thoughts to themselves. If it was true, this woman wasn't who she seemed to be. Meanwhile, in the upper room where the CEO poured himself another drink, he scoffed aloud. "A maid. Can you believe it? The nerve. Thinking one line makes them important." His assistant stood nearby, nodding weakly, though she too had felt the air change that morning. She had seen his hand tremble. She had watched the room freeze. And more importantly, she had seen the maid's face calm, unbothered, unreadable. That wasn't fear. That was confidence. The next morning brought more than sunlight through the tall glass windows. It brought a guest from the party back into the lobby downstairs, a man in a tailored charcoal suit who hadn't spoken much during the CEO's outburst. He had lingered near the bar, watching everything, saying nothing. But now he came alone, asked no questions, signed no guestbook. He merely glanced up at the building, then turned and left, making a call as he walked away. No one saw his face. Again, after that days passed, and still she remained mopping, dusting, organizing. But people had started stepping out of her way, not out of courtesy, but instinct. Some said she'd been a lawyer once, or maybe something even higher. Others claimed she was part of some program, a corporate inspector in disguise. The stories spiraled. Yet she offered no confirmation. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than the gossip. What none of them knew was that behind the scenes, things were already unraveling. The CEO's assistant sat at her desk one night, scrolling through account logs and expense sheets, preparing the usual weekly summaries. But something didn't line up. There were inconsistencies in the security access logs entries that didn't match anyone on staff. Financial reports showed internal monitoring protocols that weren't standard. Emails had been flagged. Contracts had been refiled, and the source of the changes. Every trail led to the maid's login ID, but that made no sense. She wasn't authorized to access these systems, at least. She wasn't supposed to be. At first, the assistant dismissed it as a glitch, but the deeper she looked, the clearer the picture became. Someone had been keeping an eye on things. Someone with access. Someone with authority. The maid had credentials buried deep within the company's infrastructure, credentials that outranked even the assistants. She printed the logs, staring at them in disbelief. Downstairs, the CEO paced. His office, still furious over how his authority had been publicly undermined. He hadn't forgotten the sentence. He hadn't forgotten the hush that followed it, and it had begun to haunt him. He was used to being feared, obeyed. He wasn't used to someone standing their ground, especially someone beneath him. The more he stewed, the more convinced he became that she had to go. That morning, he marched down to confront her again. She was in the lounge, adjusting the angle of the blinds to block the glare off the glass. When she saw him, she didn't stop what she was doing. "You're still here?" he snapped. "I gave instructions for you to be removed. Why are you still walking around like you own the place?" Shh. She didn't speak. Instead, she turned slightly, giving him the same calm, piercing look from before. It wasn't defiance, it was clarity. He hated it. It made him feel like a child. He barked again, louder this time, but she didn't respond. The assistant, clutching the access logs, stepped into the hallway just in time to see the standoff. She hesitated, then approached slowly. "Sir," she said carefully, "we may have a problem." He spun toward her, still boiling. "Now?" She handed him the printouts. He scanned them. Confusion crept across his face, followed by disbelief, then denial. This can't be right. She's not authorized. She's not even on the official." He paused, flipped the page, and looked at her. "This means she has access to internal audits?" The assistant nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. It's more than that, ... It appears she was never hired through the usual service. She came through corporate." The CEO's face drained of color. "Corporate?" He echoed. In the lounge, the maid turned back to the window, calmly adjusting the final blind. Her back to them now, her message was clear. She had been listening, and she wasn't going anywhere. The confrontation had begun again. But this time, she wasn't on the defensive. The tension in the boardroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Morning light poured across the table where the senior staff sat in silence, hands folded, eyes darting nervously. At the head of the table, the CEO slammed his fist down, sending his coffee sloshing over the rim of his mug. "This is outrageous," he growled. "I want her fired today. No more delays, no more excuses. She undermined me publicly, accessed private systems, and walked around this place like she owns it. She's a maid, for God's sake. I will not be disrespected by someone who scrubs toilets." The HR director, normally quick to nod in agreement, sat very still. A manila folder rested in front of her, its top corner already frayed from anxious fidgeting. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Sir, ... She's not on the regular payroll. She's not under housekeeping, nor hired through the agency we use. She's here under a different classification." The CEO narrowed his eyes. "What classification?" The HR director opened the folder and slid it toward him. He snatched it, scanned the first page, then the second. His jaw tightened. "She's under a corporate-level contract," the director explained. "Signed and cleared by someone 3 tiers above your authority level. Her title is restricted. There's no contact number, no supervisor listed, and no expiration date on her term." He blinked at her, stunned. "So ... what? You're saying I can't fire her?" She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The room had already shifted. Whispers traveled down the line of staff. No one wanted to be the first to speak, but they all sensed it. Now this wasn't just a disciplinary matter. Something far bigger was unfolding, and it was far beyond the CEO's control. Before he could react further, the boardroom door opened. 2 men in black suits stepped inside, their badges clipped to their belts, their expressions unreadable. Corporate security. But they weren't here for the woman. They were looking at him. "Mr. CEO," one of them said calmly, "you'll need to come with us." The CEO rose to his feet, indignant. "You can't be serious. I'm the executive in charge of this entire property. Make the decisions here." But the men didn't budge. "We've been instructed to escort you to a secured location. You are not under arrest, but your access has been temporarily suspended." The color drained from his face. He looked around the table for support, but no one moved. No one spoke. In the sudden silence, a voice echoed behind them, measured, quiet, but impossible to ignore. "You forgot who actually signs your checks?" All heads turned. She stood in the doorway, no longer dressed in her maid's uniform. Instead, she wore a crisp black blouse, slacks, and a corporate badge clipped to her hip. The same woman he had belittled in front of guests, mocked in the hallways, and tried to erase from the building's structure now stood before them as his equal. No, his superior. "I've been here longer than you think," she said calmly. Stepping into the room, "My job isn't to serve drinks or clean up after tantrums. I was sent by corporate compliance 6 months ago to conduct a covert ethical review of this property's top leadership, was embedded under a service classification, so I could observe interactions without interference. That includes how employees are treated, how funds are handled, and whether the environment meets corporate values." She turned to the HR director, who now sat frozen in disbelief. "Thank you for not altering the records. I needed that clean trail," the CEO stammered. You've been spying on me." "I've been watching you," she corrected, "and listening to every racist remark, every unethical order, every misuse of funds. I've documented verbal abuse, hostile work conditions, intimidation of staff, and financial manipulation in contract approvals. All of it is backed by audio and video recordings secured on corporate servers." Her eyes scanned the room. "Many of you here were witnesses. Some of you participated. Others kept silent out of fear. But you won't have to anymore." Of the corporate officers stepped forward, holding a secure tablet. "Internal audit records confirm her authority. She's part of the Integrity Division, a specialized task force assigned by the board to evaluate executive conduct," she reports. Directly to the Oversight Committee, CEO sat down slowly, the fight leaving his eyes. "You set me up," he said under his breath. But she shook her head. "No, you did that yourself. I just held up the mirror." Around the table, the senior staff exchanged glances, some ashamed, some ashamed. They had all misjudged her. They had assumed that her silence meant submission, that her uniform erased her intellect. They had walked past her, spoken over her, treated her like a ghost in the corner. But now they saw her for who she truly was, not a maid, but a monitor. A quiet force sent to measure the soul of the company. The assistant who had discovered the access logs earlier now stood at the back of the room, trembling slightly. She had suspected something, but not this. And yet, it made sense. The way the woman carried herself, the calm, the discipline. She hadn't been following orders, she'd been documenting them. The CEO was escorted from the room. It's no longer roaring like a lion, but walking like a man who had just realized the throne beneath him was built on sand. As the door shut behind him, the room remained still. She looked at the staff, her voice softer now. "Some of you will be interviewed. Some of you will be rewarded. It depends on what you chose to do when no one was watching." And with that, she left, not storming, not gloating, just walking, straight-backed and certain, leaving behind a stunned silence and a truth no one could ignore. They hadn't been serving a maid. They had been working beside the most powerful person in the building. And now, every eye saw her not for the clothes she wore, but for the weight she carried. Power had never been about shouting. It had always been about knowing exactly when to speak. And who was really listening? The morning the board arrived, everything was quiet, eerily so. The penthouse that once buzzed with arrogance and excess now felt frozen in time. Staff moved in near silence, avoiding eye contact, unsure of what the day would bring. Word had already spread. She wasn't a maid. She never had been. She was something entirely different, something no one had seen coming. The hush over the building wasn't out of fear, but awe. No one had expected the story to end this way, least of all the man who had ruled these halls like a tyrant. The private elevator chimed and opened. Out stepped the board of directors, surrounded by legal advisors and compliance officers. Faces were grim, purposeful, unreadable. They didn't bother with pleasantries. They moved through the halls like they owned them, because technically they did. At the center of the conference room sat the CEO, no longer loud and fiery, but pale, hunched slightly, like someone who knew the ground beneath him was giving way. He stood as they entered, offered a forced smile, and tried to recover the confidence that had long since drained from him. "I think there's been some confusion," he began. "This whole thing has been blown out of proportion. There were misunderstandings. Tensions were high. The business has been under pressure, and sometimes things get misinterpreted. If anyone felt insulted, that was never my intent. He glanced nervously at the board members, searching for a flicker of sympathy. None came. I believe this can be handled internally without making a scene, he added, already sweating. But the chair of the board raised a hand, cutting him off. Behind her, a screen flickered to life. The woman he had once shouted at, humiliated, and dismissed, stepped forward, not in a uniform, not with a mop or tray, but in full corporate attire. Her ID badge gleamed under the lights. She carried a black folder, which she placed neatly on the table before opening it. No need for dramatics. No anger in her voice. Only truth. For the next 30 minutes, she presented what she had gathered. Audio clips of the CEO's racially charged rants behind closed doors. Video footage of staff being degraded. Evidence of altered contracts and misallocated funds. And written testimonials, some anonymous, others not, confirming a pattern of abuse and misconduct. Every file was logged, time-stamped, and legally obtained. Some staff had even provided explicit consent, believing her to be someone they could. Finally, trust. She had not come to destroy a man. She had come to defend the integrity of the organization. Her role was never to clean the floors, was to examine what crawled across them when no one was looking. She had done her job. And now, her superiors were here to do theirs. The CEO sat frozen, eyes darting, mouth twitching, trying to find an escape that didn't exist. He attempted one last plea, claiming he had been set up, that this was all part of a personal vendetta. That stress and long hours had clouded his better judgment. But his words bounced off stone-faced board members who had already made their decision. One by one, key staff were called in. Those who had ignored the abuse turned a blind eye, or participated, were placed on probation or dismissed immediately. But others, those who had shown kindness, who had defended the invisible, who had spoken truth in small, quiet ways, were offered promotions, raises, and permanent positions. She had noted them all. Their names were on her list. The final act came quickly. A member of corporate security placed a folder in front of the CEO. Inside was a termination letter, a revocation of privileges, and a summary of violations. His penthouse access was rescinded, effective immediately. Stood slowly, too stunned to fight. Legal teams flanked him, guiding him toward the exit. The hallway was lined with staff who had once tiptoed around him.
Now they stood straight,
Watching in silence as he passed, some with relief, some with quiet satisfaction. There were no cheers, no applause, just accountability. As the elevator doors closed behind him for the last time, the woman made her way to the balcony on the top floor. The city stretched below her, sprawling and brilliant, alive with noise and movement. She stood still, no longer hidden in the background, no longer underestimated. Her uniform was gone, replaced by sharp lines, a sleek badge, a presence that filled the space without trying. Inside the building, her name now echoed with a different kind of respect. People spoke it with weight, not gossip. The lessons she carried had been made visible. Those who once looked past her would now remember her forever, not for the sentence she had spoken, but for what it revealed. Power was never about volume. It was about purpose. And truth didn't need permission to stand tall. She leaned slightly against the railing, the wind brushing her face, calm and clear. The story others had written for her had burned to ash. She had written her own ending, and it spoke louder than any title. Somewhere down the hallway, a quote she had once whispered to herself was now framed on the wall outside the conference room. Etched in polished metal for all to see, never underestimate someone just because they serve you.